That DHL thing was quite interesting. I wrote monoculture and I wrote all sorts of bad things on my note because it seemed like almost a movement of people that had the same mind, the same thoughts, and then I saw that questionnaire of people characterizing the culture, and that was actually quite diverse, and that surprised me a lot. So any comments on this? Because what they did is that they had this super change in their operations. So it's really a structured, lean, high-performance organization. And it's just running by the numbers. And it's the same way as the Danish PostNord is handling that package. It's just on-time delivery, people trained to do exactly what they're supposed to do. So it's a super example of a cost strategy, but they managed to squeeze in some sort of differentiation and trying to do both. And I think that's quite impressive. She just told us in the break that they only have an annual employee turnaround about 6%, which is really, really low. I think the average is about 15% in that industry, perhaps a little bit more. So people like to stay there, and it's not because they are leading in salary and paying high salaries. So there's something about the way they manage their people, even though it seems like it's a really top-down structure, something is working. And there's something about the culture, and particularly the artifacts they use. You noticed all the things she had hanging on her keychain? All these were badges of courses that she took. She was IT specialist and this CIS, and everyone is supposed to run around these things. So you can immediately navigate who knows something about a particular area. So that in itself instills a sort of navigation system, and it also provides some hierarchy. But it's not a pronounced hierarchy. So it just allows people to interact and be very explicit about what competences they have. And some people, of course, they buy into this. But it's interesting that it's really working there. Comments for this? No? Otherwise, we're going to jump into processes, which is, of course, this little thing in our STAR model. And processes is the way we work. And this is an example of task interdependency. 3 distinctly different ways of organizing a process. And one example would be the way that you organize your group work. If it's a group that doesn't really like each other and they just decide what to deliver, then each take their own part. They don't discuss anything. They just work independently, and they put it into a common document in the end and ship off the product. Then pool performance, each of them enters the project. But there's no communication here. Another way of organizing group work is do it really sequentially. Every time someone has written something, an introduction, and then we go to the background, and then someone writes the theory, sequential performance. Again, there's no communication between the parties. Both of these rely on standardization and at least some sort of explicit agreement. Who's supposed to do what, and how do we deliver the right quality? The reciprocal performance, on the other hand, that requires each of the participants in the project to talk. We continuously navigate, I've done this, how does that fit with your? There's an interaction between. So what you learn in from one person is it feeds into the other, how the other works. So these are distinctly different ways of working, and it's nice to have this view of how you can organize work. If it's complex work, we often end up in reciprocal performance. And sometimes when complex work fails, then it's because it wasn't really reciprocal performance. It was supposed to be, but we ended up in pool performance. We ended up in a situation where we didn't really know what each of us was supposed to do, and we never communicated, but we just delivered in the end. Hopefully it was good enough. Sequential performance, that's basically the assembly line. But it's also a picture of how we used to do engineering. When you look at engineering organization, it's referred to as over-the-wall engineering. Engineer 1 makes a specification, and then he did the grinder, and he throws the basic specification of the grinder into the next guy who uses the conveyor belt, and then he takes the specification and says, 2 meters wide, excellent, I'm going to make the perfect thing for this particular situation. And the problem is that sometimes you end up in a very costly system, where it would have been nice if these engineers would sit down and negotiate and come up with a plan for how should we actually do this. If I make a grinder that is 1 meter wider, then it's going to be extremely costly here for the guy making the conveyor belts, because that's just a new product. We've never done that before. And increasingly engineering companies, all engineering companies know that. Over-the-wall engineering is just bad for business, and it's better to work in reciprocal teams. So now we're going to talk about program versus non-program decision making. And that ties in nicely to the DHL, because what I heard she was saying is that we made loads of standards. We made loads of standard operating procedures. That means a lot of what they do is program decisions. You have the authority very low in the hierarchy, and you have that because you know how you're supposed to deal with a particular situation. So decision making is basically the process by which managers respond to opportunities and threats. And that's also the day-to-day operation with clients. And we simply make these and try to do the best we can with the decisions and be as precise to reach the organization goals as possible. So program decision making, I mean, that's what we do most of the time. We as human beings are hard-coded to do program decision making. We learn stuff, and as soon as we learn something, we repeat the same decision over and over. It worked, so I'm going to do the same again, and same again. We don't even think about it. We just act and we respond to the situation. In organizations, we do the same. We train people to behave in a specific way. We run out of supplies. There's a little piece of paper saying, well, go down here and order stuff. We do that. There's a plan for how we deal with that. So as soon as we run into a situation, and it's a standard situation, then we do the same behavior again. And it's really efficient, but it's also a danger that you sometimes run into a situation that's slightly different, but you still react in the same old way. And then we end up in non-programmed decision making. Non-programmed decision making, that's every time it's new, it's unknown, and it's not non-routine. Of course, the basic issue is that we never know exactly if it's new or unknown. If it's just on the border of being something we've seen before, our instincts will be to categorize this problem, same as usual, and behave the same way. Nevertheless, no non-programmed decision making, that poses a lot of problems for us. So it could be under time. There's a certain timeline. We need to do something. We need to decide. We have to deal with this. And sometimes it just becomes decision based on intuition, judgment. Because I have experience, I'm able to make fairly good decisions within some field. But it's really the source of many problems. And there are basically, there are a number of decision models. And it's interesting to go back to this classical model of decision making, because, I mean, many of us still think that there is a way to make decisions. You list all the alternatives. I'm going to buy a new computer, so I'm going to list all the alternatives, and I look at the consequences. Some are more quick, some are more expensive, some have more memory, some have different design. There's a lot of parameters. And then I try to come up with some sort of ranking, and I rank the different computer models I've seen. And of course, that ends up with, I select this alternative that leads to the best situation. So we make decisions, but this of course assumes that if this is going to be an optimal situation, or optimal decision, it assumes that we have all information, all relevant information about all alternatives. And anyone who has tried to make a decision and just tried to come up with alternatives of something, we know that we don't have all the alternatives. We always make some sort of, that's enough. We simply cannot have all alternatives. It also assumes that we or the managers possess the ability to process this information, that we are really able to compare. And sometimes we're dealing with not objective things, but it could be a value decision. And how do we process that? How do we actually compare those different values? In the end, it also assumes that we know what the consequences will be in the future. We can look into the crystal ball and say, well, if I make this choice, the world is going to turn this direction. We don't know that. So there's a lot of problems in the classical decision making. Nevertheless, it's the basis of the way that we make a lot of decisions. The administrative model is different, because here of course, it's a reaction to the classical model. Someone once looked and said, well, perhaps we are not that smart. We are limited to bounded rationality. We don't know everything. We have distinct and very limited capabilities. So we interpret stuff, we process, we act on information. We don't have full information. We do it on the fly. So the problem of not having full information is that we don't know all the alternatives anymore. We suddenly need to balance this decision. And it also leaves us with risk and uncertainty. I mean, risk, here we can put a label on and say, well, there's 20% chance that this will happen. We can deal with that. And how often does it happen? And what is the consequences? So we can calculate that, try to be as engineering as possible. But uncertainty, chance events, things that just happen, we can't predict that. So those are the things that go into the administrative model. So we deal with this ambiguous information. Ambiguous just simply mean that we don't know how to interpret it. At least it can be interpreted in many different ways. So we look at this piece of information and say, well, is this good? Does it point the market in that direction? Does it mean that performance is up or down? And that's simply saying that we have incomplete information. We don't have time. At least we don't have money to search out all solutions. I was studying a company that made software once. And one of the basic decisions they had to make very early in the startup was, should we go on a Microsoft platform or should we go on an open source platform? Huge implications. The Microsoft platform would mean that they would have to pay up front a lot of money, but they would get a lot of tools. The open source platform would mean that they would probably get higher performance in the end. They would get better control of the flow of the data in the system. This was going to be a search engine. And they would be able to adapt to a lot of more situations. Whereas the Microsoft system would lock them into a particular market. They didn't have time to go through a very systematic approach. So it ended up being not a toss of coin, but simply a matter of, if we're going to deliver a product to the market very soon, then we don't have time to build our open source platform. We can take the development tools from Microsoft, and that will get us at least to proof of concept. We can use a standard Microsoft database in the beginning and show the concept. So we could be at a market within 1 year. If they'd chosen the open source platform, they would have taken at least, the estimate at that time would be 1.5 years. But a completely different product, perhaps a much better performing product. But that's just guessing. So in the end, it's just going to be satisfying. That's search and choose the most acceptable alternative. So in this model, we go through 6 steps. Simply, first, recognize the need. But sometimes recognizing the need, that's not easy. I mean, in 2008, there was a huge financial market crash. For some, that was not a surprise. There were a few people that had been very vocal and said, well, it's not good. Everything's overheating, really big problem. Don't do this. We need new laws. And those that were making money would say, they're just whiners. Someone should have reacted. The signs were there. No one realized it. So the next step is to generate alternative. And the classical failure here is to generate one alternative. That also goes for engineering and product development. We need a new thing, and the engineers come up with one new thing. Not 5 different proposals for design, and then a selection and choose, but one thing. So always generate alternatives. Just having a few alternatives allows us to compare. It allows us to discuss what is it that we're actually looking for. Then we go into assessing these alternatives. And what we need is just some criteria. Up front, what are we looking for? Is it performance? Is it time? These are basic issues. And if you're switching suppliers, then you would probably look at what is this delivery speed? If I place an order now, would I get delivery next week, 2 months? Is the price? At what price point do they deliver? Are they reliable? Can we be sure that they're doing? Also size, a simple thing as size can mean a lot. If you're a small producer, then it's not fun to be a small producer from a really, really big supplier. Then you just put a number in the system. You would probably want to find someone at your own size you can negotiate. So these are criteria that goes into this. And then that allows us a sort of comparison, a reasonable assessment. So it's a best estimate. We don't have the optimal, we don't have the complete information, but it allows us at least to make an informed decision. And of course we go through these layers and say, well, when we make a decision, is it legal? It should be legal. Is it ethical? And it's quite interesting that the book highlights the need that some companies, because there has been a period of time where decisions were highly unethical, we suddenly need an ethics manager, someone that makes sure that we don't behave really, really bad. And then it has to be economical, of course. We need to make money. And in the end, these three are not enough to ensure that it's a good decision. We might be able to, on a narrow side, make money and might be ethical, but is it practical? We implement something, we make a change now. Can we actually do that without hurting ourselves, without threatening other organizational goals? So that's always sort of the practical issue of the day-to-day business. Fourth thing, of course, we choose between these alternatives. We risk and we rank and we try to find what is the best thing, and then we make a decision. And implement. And it sounds so nice and easy when we say implement. Implementing is a mess. It's changing behavior. It's buying stuff and setting new stuff up and trying to convince people to use it. It never goes as planned. It's always a mess. And many, many, many people and many organizations fail in implementing. So, and sometimes even decisions are made, they're put in the minutes, it's put on the board meeting, we've decided to do this, and nothing happens. Nothing changes. None of the managers are doing what they're supposed to do. And
Kasper,
yeah.
maybe about implementation, we should mention the, I don't know if you've heard about the Sundhedsplatform in Denmark. Those of you that are Danish probably have. Or we have a very nice project about changing all the signal systems for the Danish trains. These two examples are really good because they are about implementing. And they are about reward systems. Because in both of these projects, managers were given a bonus for successful implementation. At least in Sundhedsplatform, they were. And those of you who followed the discussion, or if I can give you a small recap, is that it's a complete fuck up, and nurses hate it, and doctors hate it. And then the board, the board executive manager, he stated, well, the reason why the manager got the bonus for Sundhedsplatform was that he delivered the project on time. Basically saying, well, we could switch on the button on time. Yes, that is correct, but it doesn't work. I mean, it doesn't deliver us the value that we were actually expecting it to do. So there's definitely something about organizational decision processes and when you actually choose to say something is implemented or not, which relates very nicely to the reward system and also to the value proposition of this. Let's just talk about Sundhedsplatform, is that what is actually the criteria for evaluating when something is implemented.
And the railway case is even worse. Here you had a couple of directors who got a nice bonus for implementing a system, not on time, not up to specification. Basically, they did not deliver what was promised in the contract for receiving bonus. And the reason they got the bonus is that they made a huge effort.
They worked really hard.
They worked really hard.
So you got bonus. You just got your salary. You got your 100,000 kroner bonus.
It just doesn't work that way.
No?
Incidentally, we sometimes get complaints on this course, and the main argument is, I worked really hard, my grade is not very good. And the answer is, of course, well, we give you the grade based on performance, results, not on effort. Sorry. So there's a disconnect here between the two. Not that is going to happen here. So successes, I've just highlighted these sentences. Success is rewarded and failure should be subject to sanction. That's a sentence in the book, and it's a very simplistic approach. I mean, sometimes failures happen, and then should we just sanction everyone? Implementing stuff is hard, and it's a big process. So just take that with a pinch of salt, that you should just simply reward and sanction. And then the last step, learn from feedback. Every project management book, every conceivable place, it says, well, do a postmortem analysis. Something happens, we did a project, and it really appears obvious. And very many fail to do so. Sometimes we see people that doesn't do any postmortem. The next step is that they actually met after the project or the implementation, they discussed it, and they agreed that something was good or bad, but it doesn't change anything. This bad or good experience is not fed back into new behavior. So for this to work, you have to have a systematic discussion. What did we do in the project? What worked well? What should we reinforce in the next project? And what behaviors were really bad? And that should really drive guidelines for future decisions. So just as show of hands, how many do a real post-mortem after you've done a project work in a group? Meet up and discuss and make sure you don't make the same mistake again? No. Well, we usually don't do that. We hand in the report and then see you guys and then have a beer. And something might actually be learned by just sitting down 5 minutes and say, well, we got this great and that was really good, so what went well? Or, we got this great, that was really shitty. What went wrong? So I can encourage you to do this. It's a simple thing. Then we move into group decision making. I mean, groups are good because groups have many different competences. You have individuals who are experts in each of their fields, and they make many, many, many decisions. But a simple thing that's really a problem in group work is groupthink. And it sounds simple, and it sounds like it's not a big issue. But it's basically, per definition, it's a pattern of false and biased decision-making that occurs in groups who thrive for agreement. And the problem is, we as human beings, when we are packing in groups, we really like to agree. We don't like to fight and quarrel. So we end up in this situation where, do we agree? Yes, sir. Everyone is on board, and this is really good, and everyone is thinking, why did we do that? This is really a bad idea. And no one wants to say anything, because if I raise my hand, then I am going to be the one. That one again who said, we tried that, and I think it's a really bad idea. And everyone said, oh, that old shit. So, yeah. But it's a major problem. It's a major problem in all organizations, in all groups, that after a while, we get used to each other. There's a modus operandi. We do it the same way. And no one wants to be that guy or that girl who says, I think what you just said is really bad and it's a bad idea. But there are counter strategies. And you should also consider this in your group work. Because after a while, in the beginning, they don't agree. And after a while, we get tired of not agreeing, and then we synthetically agree. But counter strategies is to really be explicit and accept that there are different opinions, and we should listen to those opinions. And it could also be a role like the devil's advocacy. And it could also be to simply promote diversity. Say we want people who has completely different mindsets. If we have a mechanical engineer, we should also have a biologist. 2 different mindsets. In our research group, we had a problem that every time we were reviewing papers, when someone was sort of criticizing the paper, the one who wrote it would say, well, I meant it slightly different, and I'm not sure you should perceive it that way. And then it gets into argument, and then it becomes really painful to listen to. So we made a simple rule. If you get criticized, if you have a paper that is criticized, just shut up. You're not supposed to say anything. Just let the people around you pick on your paper. They're going to be as nice as they can be, but they're going to be honest. And afterwards you can say thank you and swallow a big lump and then go back to your office and fix your paper. But it's a simple way to avoid this group thing. Because as soon as someone starts whining, then the group dynamic changes and say, well, yeah, I don't mean that, and perhaps I read it wrong. No, you didn't read it wrong. I wrote it bad, and then that's why you perceive it wrong. So use these methods. Yeah? I'm just going to throw you this.
It's just that with the feedback, if you criticize my work, but my work wasn't wrong, your criticism was wrong, isn't whining because you start whining about whether I should discuss the decision with you as well?
You should discuss it, but you should do it afterwards. So you take the first round, and then you go back to the person where you say, well, the point you're making, it's wrong because, and then you find your theories.
Okay.
And that's simply because you're trying to maintain that criticism dynamic instead of it becoming an argument, because an argument is going to put a lot of people off in the process. So you first listen to all the criticism, and then you can take those one by one individually with those afterwards.
Okay, fair point.
Yep. And we go into this 5 stages of group development. In your afternoon groups, you go through the same. There's a forming. You sign up names in a group. And then we have these conflicts and negotiations. We don't agree on anything. So right now you're probably somewhere between storming and norming. You're getting to a point where you see each other's viewpoints and then try to find the way to work together. And suddenly you have to write the report and you go into the performing phase. And then you're done. And then, of course, afterwards, you should do the postmortem to make sure what was it that really went wrong or well here. So I'm just going to show you a small movie. Because this, I think, is so much funny. And it relates to group work. And it's about how to start a movement. It shows you the faces of... it's just a couple of minutes, but it's quite fun in the sense that it shows us how quickly a movement
So ladies and gentlemen,
dynamics.
at TED we talk a lot about leadership and how to make a movement. So let's watch a movement happen, start to finish, in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons from it. First, of course, you know, a leader needs the guts to stand out and be ridiculed. But what he's doing is so easy to follow. So here's his first follower with a crucial role. He's going to show everyone else how to follow. Now notice that the leader embraces him as an equal. So now it's not about the leader anymore, it's about them, plural. Now there he is calling to his friends. Now if you notice that the first follower is actually an underestimated form of leadership in itself. It takes guts to stand out like that. The first follower is what transforms a lone nut into a leader. And here comes a second follower. Now it's not a lone nut, it's not 2 nuts, 3 is a crowd, and a crowd is news. So a movement must be public. It's important to show not just the leader, but the followers, because you find that new followers emulate the followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, and immediately after, 3 more people. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point. Now we've got a movement.
Now we're into the norming phase.
So, notice that as more people join in, it's less risky. So those that were sitting on the fence before now have no reason not to. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, but they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. So, over the next minute, you'll see all of the those that prefer to stick with the crowd, because eventually they would be ridiculed for not joining in. And that's how you make a movement. But let's recap some lessons from this. So first, if you are the type, like the shirtless dancing guy, that is standing alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals. So it's clearly about the movement, not you. Okay, but we might have missed the real lesson here. The biggest lesson, if you noticed, did you catch it? Is that leadership is over-glorified. That yes, it was the shirtless guy was first, and he'll get all the credit, but it was really the first follower that transformed the lone nut into a leader. So as we're told that we should all be leaders, that would be really ineffective. If you really care about starting a movement, have the courage to follow and show others how to follow. And when you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first one to stand up and join in. And what a perfect place to do that, TED. Thanks.
I just think it's a wonderful example of that. Shit. Come on. This is a nice example of how groups are formed and stormed and normed, and suddenly when the music stopped, they just adjourn afterwards. But another dimension you can take into this, how to form a group and how to develop a group, is to look at the balance of conformity divines in the group, deviance. If you are very low conformity, I mean, you're very different in the group, then the level of performance in a group is going to be low in the sense that you're going to be discussing a lot. And the same happens if you are very high in conformity. Everyone has the same view. You're not going to get any new viewpoints into this project. You're not going to get any viewpoints into this discussion. Same again, low performance. So it is about finding this optimal balance between being like-minded and being different, and getting those views into the decision, and finding a process in that context that helps and works for you to get the different opinions into a project. So this brings us to organizational learning, because the learning organization, it seems so simple in the sense that it's a process, it's nice, it's a way that we can create an organization where we develop personal mastery. We like that because that's individual interest. I'm getting good at something. At the same time, we build complex, challenging mental models. That means we allow, or we request that our employees challenge the system. They think about how we organize, they think about how we do stuff, and they question what we do. So we get this new perspective, we get new opinions, and we promote and learn team learning. And that is getting away from groupthink and building this shared vision. And the key is to build this shared vision, because if we don't have a shared vision along with the systems thinking, then these groups, well, we actually promote people to make choices individually based on their mastery, based on what they know. It can actually drive an organization in different places. But if we can instill a shared vision, and if we can instill a system thinking, then the basic idea is that if we have these different ideas, even though I want to push in this direction, I know how the system works. I know the vision. So I'm going to work with the vision. I'm going to support our organization. I'm going to try to make my ideas and my models work in this new system, instead of just going my own way. And that's the danger of this model. If we don't have the shared vision, if we don't have system thinking, we just have individuals that go each their own separate ways. And that's too much defiance and too little conformance. But it's a difficult system to build. It requires a lot of work on the vision and the system thinking. So entrepreneurship and creativity, these things are super important in companies. If we don't have entrepreneurs, people that get new ideas, that mobilize resources, that come up with these new products, then a company is slowly going to die. If they don't find it in the company, if they don't get the opportunities to follow their ideas in the company, they'll probably find a new venture on their own. They're probably going to leave the company. And that leaves us with entrepreneurs. Those have the same development skills, but they just like to do it in a structured organization. Whereas our entrepreneurs would usually want to break out and build their own thing. Then the entrepreneurs have the same propensity for building systems, for coming up with new ideas and making social networks. But they do it inside a company. So in the learning organization, I just showed you before, we can leverage these entrepreneurs. We can make what is called product champions. That's one way. If someone is really passionate about a product, really passionate about a technology, then we make those people champions. We give them resources, we give them decision authority, and we give them a group to work with. And then they're going to champion a product, and then they're going to come up with a value proposition, and of course try to mix that with a customer segment. Another way is to have skunk works. It's a famous idea that we take a group of brilliant engineers and we take them out of the organization because they're just going to be drowned in day-to-day work, and we put them in the skunk works a long way from the organization. They're not going to be troubled by day-to-day business, and they can just do what they do, and they can come up with great ideas. We worked with a radar company, or studied a radar company recently, and they decided to implement agile manufacturing or agile development in their hardware development. And one of the things they saw is that what they could do is that make some sort of skunk work. They could work for 2 weeks and do a sprint where the engineers were isolated from the rest of the company, and then they could really work and delve into their work. They enjoyed that. That was good because they didn't have to deal with the day-to-day. After those 2 weeks, they couldn't be in the skunk works anymore. They had to go back in the organization and work on the day-to-day issue. Because these engineers, they have many roles. They're not just developers. They also have a responsibility for production and maintaining other products. So after that, they had to have 1 week back in the organization, and then they could solve all these things that built up in the past 2 weeks. You could also have rewards for innovation. If you come up with a good idea, then you get stock option, or you perhaps get a part of the patent. We haven't seen a lot of those examples yet.
Just to One example that I really like about the inside the company innovation that also has a reward is CocaCola. Do you know a few years back they made the label with a name on. Remember, all of a sudden you had a Coca-Cola. It didn't say Coca-Cola. It says Rasmus or Casper or something. And this actually came from, as I know the story, from Australia, where you had inside Coca-Cola, you always have the option of spending some of your budget on trying something out, something that's completely outside the normal strategy of your company. And the reason why I like this company, or this example in this for this course, is that you have a reward system for providing good ideas. They actually also had a process for it to support a strategy of continuous developing a product which is very conforming, we all know it. And it was just inside the company. They didn't have any skunk work outside it. And I thought about if you want to have another skunk work example, it could be mobile pay.
Yeah, mobile life division.
Mobile life division in Danske Bank. They've actually changed the structure within the organization. So Mobile Life is an organization that exists outside the normal boundaries of Danske Bank, which is probably conservative and full of people with blue shirts and ties and very boring. Doesn't fit with probably an innovation company. Could be. I don't know.
Thanks. So now we're going to look at rewards and processes, and it's basically a combination when we look at control, because control is both a process, but it's also part of the reward system, because when we control, we have to measure something. We have to see how things go. But control, it's one of the 4 functions of management, and I brought up this nice picture of Lenin. Trust is good, but control is better. He was an evil control bastard. But still, we need to control. We need to look into stuff. If we don't control, if we don't measure, we can't manage. It's quite simple. So the process of control is simply, that's how we monitor and regulate. We need to get data. And the importance is quite clear, that to control accurately and to measure our use of resources, then we need to assess what's going on. We simply need to get some numbers. But with no control, we can't manage. There's an example from one of the local airlines. Recently, they decided to remove cleaning in an effort to reduce costs. Another one of those cost-cutting strategies. They removed cleaning from all flights. It was supposed to be at the end of three flights, then you clean. And have you seen a plane when people have left? Shit all over. And very quickly, a lot of complaints came in. So that order was only in effect for about 2 weeks. But it shows something about the control system. There were actually procedures in place that would measure customer satisfaction based on these changes. And of course, they realized quickly that people didn't like that, customers didn't like that. Go back to do every cleaning at every time. So the control system is also this basic formal target setting and evaluation. That's how we measure stuff. But they have to be flexible, and they have to be accurate, and they have to be timely. If we wait too long, then we're going to have a major problem. In one of the Danish banks, they had a performance review every 3 months. And you would get what's called a non-promoting conversation with your manager if you didn't perform. But it wasn't timely in the sense you couldn't learn from anything. You would have the answer or get the question, why did you perform badly in January? Now we're approaching summer. No one can remember what happened in January. So this performance management system, or at least the performance measurement system, was not timely at all. So we basically work with 3 types of control. We have the input stage, conversion, and output stage. And most performance management systems work on the output stage. The result, we measure the result, what came out of it, and then we learn from that. Hopefully we learn. We can only learn if it's timely and we have data on what went wrong. But input stage, we see a lot. Every time you fill a form on the internet, you have input stage control. You can only put in the right information. Going back to the bank example, the basic measure of control was output. That was a corporate level control system. But managers at individual branch offices had developed personal measures. They did both conversion stage and input stage. Conversion stage was checking how they actually did their day-to-day treatment of customers. Asking each employee, how are you doing? How many are you dealing with today? And what's the backlog you have? That was the conversion stage, the actual process. But they also had input stage. And input stage in that business was, how many meetings have you booked? So here you have a timeline in the local branch office that's about 8 weeks. The input stage is, you need an 6 to 8 week target and booking of meeting with customer. And after those, you go into a conversion stage, and then you can check the product afterwards. But the basic system, the system of performance management that was used in the whole bank, not in the branch office, only measured the output. So here you had a sort of a tension between the way you're measured, because the measurements go into the reward system. The reward system only controls the output stage, and that affects people a lot. But in local branch office, they would also be measured on these issues, and that was not part of the system. But that worked well. So the 4 steps of control, that goes into all three of these different types of control are, first step, establish standards. What are we actually measuring? What are we trying to achieve? Is it time? Is it performance? What are the performance goals that we're measuring? We need some sort of metric. Sometimes it can be behavior. Behavior is just really difficult to measure. But we might get some keys. Then we measure the actual performance. And then we compare the performance with what targets we were setting. And then we evaluate and try to come up with either sanction or some sort of way to promote that behavior. We can see that if you do that, that's really, really good. So, yeah, that's the same thing. But when we go into this, we also have other types of control. We have the output control. We also have behavior control and plan control. The output control, those are the simple, what are we doing? What should be the specific goals? And those we can break into different organizational levels. We need to be the best at something. Rigshospitalet wants to promote something, better treatment for their clients. And that trickles down all the way through the organization. But another thing that's not a big thing in the book, but it's budgets, simple operating budgets. This is one of the day-to-day control mechanisms that's really used a lot. The operating budgets goes into each department. It just simply says how much money can a department spend over the year and what they're supposed to be spent on. So that's the housekeeping budget. And that says a lot about the activity a department can have. It also says a lot about who is allowed to use those money. At a university, there's always a tension between, should that money be given to the individual lecturers? That'll be nice, I can buy my books, I can go on conferences. Or should there be some sort of discussion? Should we give it to the department, who then selects who is supposed to go to the conferences and who's supposed to buy what? It's constant tension. Every time you put that up to someone to decide, then there's going to be some sort of criteria. And that criteria suddenly becomes subject to political discussion. So operating budgets, super boring, very important, and always a source of tension. We can also have direct supervision. That's your manager leaning in and saying, what are you doing? That's good. It's really good for changing people's behavior. But it's expensive, so we don't have a lot of time to do it. So, and at the same time, it's a dual-edged sword. If you have too much close supervision, then people are going to feel, well, I'm just going to get monitored, and I'm always going to get told. And that's demotivating. So there is some sort of, how much supervision can we actually have? Another way to handle this is management by objectives. This is used in many places where the individual can influence their operating goals. Management by objectives is that at the department level, we have some overall goals. And then as a manager, I ask each of my employees, how can you deliver into those goals? And the simple way is that we need to make 430 sales this year, and we are 43 people, then we're going to make 10 each. Of course, that doesn't, it's used some places, but that's completely unfair, because that assumes that everyone is alike and everyone can make the same sales. So it quickly becomes a discussion, and actually a fruitful discussion, of who should deliver 53 and who should deliver 33. We've seen that a lot in banking industry or in service industry, where you can use this to take the individual employee's competence into account. So it becomes actually a quite nuanced discussion. And it also requires that you have periodic reviews. There has to be some sort of reasonably quick feedback, so if the employee cannot deliver, then you have to change your goals, or you have to change, not the employee, but change the process surrounding this employee. And then you're going to have bureaucratic control, dedicated rules. We do like this and nothing else. And DHL sounded like there were a lot of bureaucratic controls. So it's effective, but it's not very flexible. You institute a lot of rules, and those rules have to be followed very tightly. So, of course, we have here the organizational clan control. This is the last part of the control system, and it seems that this particular type of control is used a lot in DHL. I mean, we have a culture, we have values, norms, and beliefs. Those are the ones that we try to promote. And you saw that thing she had around her neck with all the badges. That's artifacts of the culture. But clan control comes in where the manager is not present, and my colleagues begin to influence and say, you're not doing it right, and why do you behave like that? In this situation, you should do something else. Then you have clan pressure on you. And it's an efficient way of working. It's an efficient way of influencing culture. But it's also very close to being bullying. So there is clan pressure should not turn into being bullying. And sometimes the line can be very thin. It's really good, and it's efficient because managers don't have to be present here. It, of course, assumes that that culture we are giving away and we are passing on to the next generation, it's one of those good cultures. It's what we call an adaptive culture. It's a culture that fits with our strategy. So if we promote this culture, we're going to continue to have good results. If it's a wrong culture, well, then we're just going to instill behaviors that doesn't really work in our organization. And that leaves us with this: when it doesn't work, how should we balance this? There are two forces. There is an internal need to improve our operations. That's here. We need to be more efficient. And it's also part of our efficiency side of our strategy, of the cost structure. Here we establish routines. Here we try to be better at doing things. And that has to be balanced against the need to respond to outside events. If we always focus on outside events, we're always going to change our structure internally. And we're never going to be very efficient at what we do. So there's always a balance. And it's a tension between the two, but it's a balance that needs to be addressed. And lastly, we have these 4 steps in organizational change. Again, assessing the need for change, that's perhaps one of the difficult things. When do we recognize that there is a problem? In our cases, in the afternoon, we work and we identify a problem. That sort of tricks us and start the process. But in reality, sometimes it's quite difficult to identify the problem. Here we promote identify the source of the problem. And here you see the difference between the AT Kearney and the implement, where AT Kearney we just focus on the future, but where it's implement and we suggest identify the source of the problems, and then begin to decide what changes are we going to make. Decide what the future state will be. Because it's basically where are we now, or where do we want to be? And then we start implementing. Implementing is, as I said before, really difficult. Here it says either it's top-down or bottom-up, but it can very well be a balanced thing. So you start top-down, and then you relinquish control and have your employees do something, which then becomes a bottom-up process. And then you perhaps have management freeze that process again. So you have a top-down and a bottom-up and a top-down process. But implementing, that's an art, and it's difficult. And of course, in the end, you do the postmortem, you evaluate, as you would do in group work. And that's basically it for today. So any last comments here, 1 minute before 12? No? Thank you for joining. Have a nice afternoon. See you next week.